Welcome to Supply Chain Next with your host, Richard Donaldson. Join us as we explore the ongoing evolution of supply chain, from the challenges professionals face every day to the ongoing digital transformation of the entire value network.
Welcome here to International Supply Chain Day recording. Super excited to have you all here. Here we are checking in year two. The whole point of today is really just for all of us to get together and talk about some of our unique observations around what's going on in the march to circularity and 50% circular by the end of the decade. And I also want to kind of kick it off by telling everybody we've got a great panel here of industry experts and also global in participation, right? So we got a couple people in North America, we got Europe. The only thing we're missing here is Asia Pac, but that's probably a little bit hard on the timing for all this sort of stuff. So we've got Ritchie here out of Chicago. We've got Lisa Morales out of New York and Marc de Wit out of the Netherlands. I think everybody can see them if you can on the live. And so I just want to start by thanking everyone for participating. I'm going to go through a little bit here and just say hi to each one of you individually, and then we'll kind of get into a group discussion around what's going on in International Supply Chain Day and each of your observations, and then kind of a free form. And if we're lucky enough with the live streaming, maybe we'll get some people from outside who might be tuning in to give us some Q&A or anything that's going on. So that'd be kind of fun. So I'm going to start with Lisa. But Lisa, I think this is you and I. This is our first time actually chatting in real time. I think we've known each other virtually forever. So thankful you and your partner Brian have founded Refashion. But would love to hear, if you don't mind, actually a little bit just about you, a little introduction, about you and what's going on with Refashion and what you kind of been up to, because I think it's such an amazing story.
Sure thing. Thank you. Thanks for having me. Refashioned is a reflection of basically my entire life's work. No big deal. 27 years in tech by way of Carnegie Mellon, design degree with a little C++ and Mosaic, Econ, etc. A stint out in Silicon Valley during the first .com boom back in '99. And yes, I'm 12 or was 12 when I was, and I was fortunate enough to really cut my teeth in the Valley after helping scale a content management software company from 20 people to 150 in a year and exit, and really dove into data structures, taxonomy, scalable architecture. And when I went out to the Valley, I was lucky enough to work at a company that was spun out of Procter & Gamble and backed by P&G and Redpoint Ventures, pioneering the space of mass customization, personalization, and on-demand micro-manufacturing, one-of-one products across cosmetics, skincare, hair care, and fine fragrance, all the way back in 1999. So I have a 22-year head start on the rest of the world in really, truly understanding this space and developing consumer-facing experiences around it. I created the first peer-to-peer marketing campaigns before there was social, using real women, and created the first virtual personal shopper using data. After a consumer created one product, we'd extract hex values based on their data set and push through Macromedia Generator to create on-the-fly graphics of products that didn't exist till they clicked through to purchase it. And then we created whole cosmetic sets to go with their specific to them, and then matching to outfits. So I was just a 26-year-old kid having the time of my life playing with all these fun things and quadrupling revenue. And the CEO of the company at the time said, do whatever Lisa says. So I got to present to the board, including AG Lafley. And at 26, having a board presentation, AG coming over and shaking your hand was like, oh, clouds parted, angels sang. And I was like, I want to do this forever. So that's what I've done. I have been obsessed with on-demand and customization, personalization throughout my career. I have architected a contextual search engine that was for algorithmically generating outfits on the fly that got into Techstars, raised a little bit of venture capital. Realize that VCs don't know boo about fashion or retail, let alone supply chain. And I got really silly comments when I was trying to raise capital for my contextual search engine, people assuming that I wanted to become a girl boss and a celebrity female founder. I'm like, I'm a data nerd. I built real IP, real tech here. It's the future of search, and chose to shut down that company instead of selling it or taking on $4 million from a fund that wanted to turn me into Sophia Amoruso, a celebrity style talking head. So shut down that company and founded the New York Fashion Tech Lab in 2014. Really wanted to kind of have the experience I wish I could have had when I had my own fashion tech company, created the first fashion tech accelerator connecting all the major brands and retailers directly with the companies looking to serve them, having their C-suite hand select the companies that they thought would add the most value to their bottom line. So those C-suite executives, I learned talking behind closed doors with them for the better part of a year, couldn't care less if their company is the reason the planet burned to the ground, or if their company went under in 5 years, because they were jumping jobs every 2 to 3. And I got angry. First of all, I made this to help you, industry, dragging this horse to water. If you want drink, maybe you all deserve to drown. So I left after the first cohort to study the apparel supply chain on my own dime for a year, tied everything back to what I had learned and done in Silicon Valley 20 years prior, and looking forward to the fourth industrial revolution, came up with my thesis that we are at a point in time where the single largest operating system to ever exist, digitization of supply chains, is just now starting. And the focus of supply chain should be on shifting from supply chains to localized demand chains with circular infrastructure. So producing one-of-one products with circular regenerative raw materials. So that's what I'm up to. And Brian and I founded Refashion Ventures to invest in these early stage supply chain innovations across data, AI, advanced materials, advanced manufacturing, and advanced logistics. 3 of those 4 things involve physical atoms, which VCs are like terrified of. But we are not going to decarbonize this planet with software alone. And so on top of Refashion Ventures, we also have the worldwide Supply Chain Federation, global community of 4,300 members around the world, supply chain enthusiasts. We call them our builders and buyers that come together to have real dialogues around the best of emerging innovations to help them scale and gain adoption faster than the world is trying to scale them. And then I'm also CEO and founder of Refashioned OS, which is our operating company that is actually deploying made in the USA localized demand chains for apparel with on-demand production, basically connecting existing factories and helping them to digitize and adopt these best practices for on-demand with real-time through capacity load bearing across all of their infrastructure.
Lisa, so I just need to take a breath there. You take a breath. I need to take a breath. That is a hell of a background.
And I'm a mom. I have 2 boys that are teenagers now.
How many?
2.
Oh, Jesus. Okay. So let's just add, and then, throw some marathons in there and God knows what else, right? So we'll get a few other things. But that's what a background. And by the way, and Mark, Kyle, you guys can certainly, chime in or whatever you've got questions. But my very first question though, Lisa, is, such an amazing perspective. But if I'm not mistaken, you and Brian founded Refashioned around, I think it was 2018-ish, 2019, is that?
So we first came together, we met in 2016. We founded the Worldwide Supply Chain Federation in 2017. We founded the fund really in 2019, end of 2019. And then it took us a long time just to get to the rolling fund, which just launched in July of 2021. And so we have a year of investments under the rolling fund, have done 16 deals.
Wow. Good for you guys. I mean, congratulations on all of that. And certainly, but whereas leading with the question is, you have auspicious timing, right? Timing is kind of everything, right? And we can all predict the wave crashing at some point, but honestly, that wave is going to crash when it crashes, right? But you're all of us are sitting here and not only did you get into, segue into supply chain, but then also supply chain investing, literally 2, 3, 4 years, 5 years before the inflection point really started shifting, which is where I think we are today. So the question to you is, in kind of reflecting on what you've seen over the last 3, 4, 5 years, certainly from an investment point of view, what are you seeing? I mean, it's sort of a self-evident question, but the enthusiasm around supply chain investments, and then also kind of a lack of clarity on how to invest in supply chain. I mean, you're bringing that in. Trust me, this is a loaded question because we've dealt with it too. But how do you kind of view that and what's happening around us, right? Because you've been at it for so long, and it's like the world's kind of catching up. Like, how do you reflect?
Yeah, I think it's great that we finally have other people paying attention to it, but it also is simultaneously like this shiny new object, like so many investment opportunities. People see the opportunity and then they run into it, and they don't have the focus or expertise or network or deep understanding of the interconnectedness of supply chains. They're investing in individual nodes or incremental pieces that is questionable if they'll actually ever scale, because they don't truly understand the systemic thinking that's required for supply chains. And so it's simultaneously a good thing because it's giving us more visibility, but it's also a really sad and disappointing thing that people that have been here for years focusing on this are still struggling to raise the capital of volume that we could be deploying compared to the legacy funds that are just now realizing, hey, supply chain looks cool, and they're getting hundreds of millions of dollars to deploy, and they don't know what the hell they're doing. I won't name names, but
oh no, we know, we all know them, and they know who they are. And they should be partnering with you. But and let me, because this is going to be a springboard question to also kind of loop back into circularity. But one of the central parts of your thesis was supply chain and circularity. Those words you use very specifically in sort of your elevator pitch there. And I'm curious because that's not always front and center. That's sort of the theme for this entire International Supply Chain Day, which is circularity. But it's also fundamental to how you look at supply chain, even from an investing point of view. Can you talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think, supply chains are systems. And I somehow lucked out getting a design degree, design thinking, which really has been applied to systems. And we need to look at all of the waste streams that we have been putting out into the world as raw materials and really assess which waste streams are no longer tenable and which waste streams should be made circular. For example, with apparel, which is the lens that I look at supply chains through just because I've been obsessed with it since I was a little girl and have a bit of experience in their infrastructure, we do not need to be growing any more fibers, frankly, at all. And so this whole focus on GOTS certified cotton and regenerative farming for GOTS certified, that's fabulous, but really neither here nor there. If we really looked at solving the issues, we need to just be investing in circular regeneration of existing fibers. We're sitting on generations worth of raw materials, of fibers, especially in the US, where we produce 4 times the textile waste of any other country in the world. We used to ship it overseas. They don't want it anymore. They're sitting on mountains of US textile waste. And so we have to figure out how to reuse this asset that we have poured money into creating and bringing into this world, and then we throw away. I think that's the no-brainer for circular regeneration within fashion.
Right. So that is a perfect springboard, because now I'm going to kind of loop over to Marc, because this is a great tag into how the Circularity Gap Report really begins to illustrate that, right? And textiles just being one piece of the 1,000 gigatons of accumulated stuff that can be reused immediately. So Marc, I'm going to kind of come over to you a little bit. I mean, a lot of things that Lisa's talking about, both from an investor's point of view, getting into supply chain, focusing on circularity, and certainly the International Supply Chain Day is about tracking, really at the end of the day, kind of outlining everything you do in your Circularity Gap Report that's coming out annually. I think you got about 4 or 5 years of history there. So, first part of the question is, Marc, welcome to the show. You've been here before, so I do want to allow you a little bit of just quick intro on who you are, but then kind of dive in a little bit on sort of just your perspective on the current Circularity Gap Report. And I think that's something that I think is, the audience needs to know about. They needs to know where they can go track that into. And every year we're probably going to be tying ourselves, even in this call, highlighting what the Circularity Gap Report talks about. And it's exactly what Lisa was referencing, right? We already have enough stuff. We've already pulled enough stuff out of the earth. Let's reuse it. So Marc.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks a lot, Richard, for having me on the show. And great, Lisa, to hear your story. I mean, I have a bit more of kind of a macro story, but I always love really where the rubber hits the road. And I mean, that's where actual change happens. And obviously I recognize this from across many different sectors we work with, where it's the built environment, nutrition, agri-food, everywhere. Really briefly, I mean, we chatted 2 weeks ago, but my first steps kind of into this space, weirdly enough, were in astrophysics, where I started to study, really in an attempt to understand and make sense of the world. But I very quickly pivoted to sustainability of energy. How do we run our energy system, our materials, etc. I later on focused on the bio-based economy. So how can we, with the agricultural lands that we have, supply enough food, but also, as you mentioned, kind of fiber for textiles, timber for construction, and all of that in a sustainable way with more people on this planet. Then moved into kind of business consulting, working with really kind of resource-intensive companies and see how could they be a part of that sustainable future. But then 10 years ago, we founded Circle Economy. So we're based in Amsterdam, only 60 people. We do projects globally at this point. We work with businesses, but also with cities, with national governments to understand from a data perspective. It's very much data driven. What is flowing through your operations, to your value chain, through your business, through your city? Where are the leaks in the system from the standpoint of materials? Where do the materials end up in incineration, landfill? Where are emissions occurring, whether that's into the plastic soup or into the air? But most importantly, or very important as well, to look at the opportunity side in terms of value. So that's really what we try to track. And 5 years ago, we thought there's so much speak about the circular economy. Everyone is speaking about different business models, etc. But it's extremely conceptual. We have no clue where we currently stand. So what we wanted to do with the Circularity Gap Report is to put a stake in the ground and say, hey, how circular are we today? Our first assessment was that we're 9.1% circular. So that means of all the materials we use globally, 9% makes it back into the economic system, 91% doesn't. And then our latest number is 8.6. So we're in reverse. All the indicators are in the red. I mean, we're using more stuff. As you said, more than 100 billion tons of stuff with everyone on this planet every year, of which barely 9 billion tons is being reused. And more than 90 billion tons is lost in whatever shape and form. So yeah, that's really kind of the premise of what we wanted to do to raise attention, but to also, as I referred to one of the central diagrams in the report, which I call an X-ray of our global economy, to really understand where is this system, this linear system, broken, and where are the opportunities to fix it. That was what we set ourselves up to when we started 5 years ago, and then 10 years ago with the organization.
So not, and just again to also kind of highlight on the day, not exactly the year after effect going from 9.1 to 8.6. We don't want to see a reverse. We want to go the other direction. But more importantly, though, at least you're measuring it. And we started a baseline discussion. I think the important factor here is not necessarily that we're at 8 or 9%. It's that we actually have identified and have a way through Marc's organization at Circle Economy to measure this and reflect on this through a report on an annual basis. Because otherwise, if you can't measure it, how are you supposed to improve it? And if we want to get to 50% circular by the end of the decade, well, hey, you got to start with these kind of things. So let me ask a question. I mean, it's only been 5 years, Marc, but is there any insight that you can maybe, you said more production, more consumerism, something, but any insights into why there might have been a little slip? Or are you more accurate with the data? I mean, first go around, it's going to be a little rough. And then each year it's going to get better and better and better. So 5 years in, kind of what's driving the small slip? I mean, it's not huge, but Yeah.
So, I mean, the data is not getting better. So on the global level, you're dependent on aggregations of 1 million different data points that are being aggregated by World Bank, by statistic bureaus, et cetera. It's, to be honest, quite kind of shaky and intransparent data, but we wanted to work with the best data we could get our hands on. And I think actually that in on a sectoral level, you see improvements to the quality of data, but definitely on the global level, we need to do it with the data that we have provided. But the slip is, I think, quite a robust insight, whether the data quality or not. And that has to do with the fact that we consume more and more. So if you just look in 2017, I think we used 92 billion tons of materials every year. Now it's 100 billion. So already in a matter of years, in 1900, it was 7 billion tons. Since the 1970s, we have tripled the amount of stuff we use, and we're really accelerating that. And we're not getting much better at the end of the chain to get more back into the system or even to keep that level. So we see more fallout of things kind of just being buried underground in landfill, incinerated, plastic soup dispersed into the environment. So we're not able to get our stuff together at the end of the chain while we are continue to consume more and more and hit the accelerator there.
A quick question on that one, and this is my system. So again, I'm just fascinated here that we got one of the other common themes that jumps out at me is systems level thinking. Lisa talked about systems level thinking. Marc, you're talking about systems level thinking. I know, Kyle, when we get there, we're going to talk about systems level thinking. But the first thing at a system level that I think about what you just said is if we were at 7 gigatons or 7 billion tons of consumption at 1900, fast forward to 2000, it's 100 gigatons. That's roughly, I'm just round math here, a 10x increase in consumption, right? Now, if I'm just off the top of my head, the population ratio to that consumption actually illustrates that we're consuming less per person. If I think about the jump in population, which I think is about 6 or 7x, it's a little, or no, I guess we're consuming more, right? So I'm just looking at the population increase. We're actually consuming more per person in the same time period.
We are, and we're set to in 2050 to hit 180 billion tons. So I mean that's really so. If we're not kind of so, I fully agreed with Lisa's point. I mean, we have so much kind of in the urban mine, not the virgin mine, that we need to use to basically get the cycle closed. So there's a lot to be done there. And the other part we need to take from regenerative systems, but it can't be extractive based. And it usually is today. And we've actually perfected that model for the last 200 years. So it will also be, I mean, it's not an easy feat to change that system around, but that's.
No, and I think one of the other things that's interesting too, Marc, and I'm going to kind of tie in, and I'm going to segue to Kyle here in a second, but and I'm going to use this pun intended, but this is the first time in history where one of the other things we're trying to do is make fashionable the use of used and circular materials, right? Up until this point, there was a visceral emotional tie to buying something new, illustrates I'm wealthy and successful, and therefore it makes me feel good, right? And I think that shift is changing. We're seeing it now kind of creep in. Certainly with the sharing economy, that impact is very different now. Think about people who are now born into cars that aren't really owned anymore and their thoughts around owning a car versus people who are like my age and older who owning a car was all about feeling good about themselves. It had to be new, right? Buying a used car at one point in time was seen as like, ooh, that's bad, right? So I think there's also just a philosophical shift we're in the midst of that I think the world from a kind of marketing perspective is beginning to hear, because you're seeing brands now, launch with the idea around circularity, around sustainability, around that's not happened before. That's happening concurrently, and that's going to drive a lot of the behavior patterns. We're trying to kind of go at the enterprises and things like that, but there's also a big global philosophical shift that's moving towards, hey, it's no longer cool to pull things out of the ground if I don't need to, and making sure everyone understands that. Like they begin to associate feeling good with using used stuff, not using new stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to pause here for a second. Not pause. I'm going to switch over to Kyle, because this also then kind of segues right into circular economy for dummies, in the sense of what we've talked about, and we kind of go from Lisa's talking really about at a macro level and kind of getting in, really fundamental, especially from the industry. Marc's got that macro view of kind of what's, why we need to do this sort of stuff. But then also, and we just talked a little bit about the people who are the consumers, but now the businesses. I mean, this is circular economy is not just a feel good, fun, environmental, beat the drum. It actually is a profit first strategic advantage decision where you begin to increase profits by moving circular. You get to reduce risk in your supply chain because now all of a sudden you've got a circular supply chain, not a brittle linear supply chain that any chain link breaks. Circularity has some more legs to it, a certainty to it. And then on top of which, obviously the benefits to the overall sustainability, right, actually kind of come once we focus on profitability first. So let's talk about circular economy for dummies. Like, how is that kind of fundamental into the thesis of the book itself and your own, what got you inspired to write the book?
Yeah, the inspiration came pretty soon after, I'd say probably 3 years after I even came about the term circular economy. I was desperately looking for some sort of framework that wasn't just sort of limiting itself to what we all know is sustainable, breaking even, essentially. If we've been doing such harm to the environment and global supply chain for how long now, clearly we have to go to the opposite end of the spectrum, not just sit in the middle of it, if we're ever going to sort of offset all of the negative influence that we've had. So from coming across the circular economy, I was like, oh my gosh, this is it. This is that regenerative framework that looks to eliminate waste and keep things in circulation. And just by doing that, you can allow the natural environment to regenerate itself. And that's what sustainability in my mind was always missing. I work in the architecture and construction industry. So, we're building the equivalent of New York City every 5 weeks. That's an absurd amount of building materials that we're consuming.
And is that just domestic or is that global? That's
global.
Wow.
So it's, again, every 5 weeks, New York City is being constructed around the world, which is, it's just astounding to consider that scale. And so really my efforts are all aligned with the idea that we have to go beyond sustainable if we're going to be solving the waste generation issue that is associated with architecture and construction. There's about a 37% waste factor for every single construction project. So that means that out of all the material that arrives on a construction site, 37% of it is going to end up in the landfill. The rest of it is going to be recycled, and I'd say less than 1% is actually getting reused. But that's where our market sits. The AEC industry, they think that sustainability is our guiding force, and therefore recycling is the best option. And so really my goal within my industry, both in and outside of my 9 to 5, is to show that the opportunity of reuse is going to solve a lot of the issues that we're experiencing. Supply chain costs as well. I mean, goodness sakes, we're putting projects on hold now because supply chain issues are making it nearly impossible to do what we could do even 5 years ago for the budget that's available. So even though I'm in architecture, I come from a very systems thinking background. Even though I left architecture school because I hated it, I went into the sciences because it made so much more sense. I figured out how the world worked. And from that, once you get to understand how supply chain and system thinking can be organized and designed, then you can look at fashion, you can look at architecture, you can look at technology, pretty much any different market you want to focus on. And it's really the same language, different materials, same language. And so that's what the Circular Economy for Dummies was really all about, is me taking time and assessing these different markets, making it a very digestible message. Circular Economy for Dummies is not supposed to be a textbook. It's supposed to be very approachable. Each chapter is very independent, and you're supposed to write as if you're explaining it to your in-laws. So you have to be a little easy with the details, but you also want to, make it enjoyable and digestible. So Circular Economy for Dummies was my attempt to essentially assess where each market is, what their goals should be, and then what steps need to happen in between to make all of that happen. So yeah, it was a great project, and it happened during the pandemic when I had nothing to do. So I was like, all right, this is perfect timing. So yeah, it went really well, and it's been out for just over a year now. It came out in April of last year.
Well, A, congratulations. B, the timing, like everyone here on this call, seems to be very auspicious, and chance favors the prepared, as they like to say, right? But in this case, though, I want to focus on a couple things. One is, the Circular Economy for Dummies. You wrote it, but it's got a life to it, right? And the book itself is going to have different, not improvements is the wrong word. When you do the additions or the updates or whatever, like even Dan Stanton, who wrote, Supply Chain Management for Dummies, right? And he's a friend and family of everyone on here, and we all know Dan. He's awesome, Mr. Supply Chain. Shout out to Dan, by the way, if he's listening. But my point is, he's just updating his book, I think, the second or third time now, right? And so I think circular economy, based on this whole phone call, over this next decade, you're going to see even, I imagine in your own head, you're saying a year or two from now, how am I going to update this? What's the new chapter? How am I going to tweak some things? And I go back to what's fundamental in the title is the economy, right? You're looking at a system level of the global economy. Marc's organization has that view of the entire supply chain through the data and the infographic that they have created, right? Lisa's investing to drive that innovation, into that supply chain. But again, I come back to, this is an economic driving force, right? And I think that's one of the parts of the conversation that, even though all of us here, we've already, not only we're making the Kool-Aid, right? I mean, not only have we drunk it, we're making it. But why has the world picked up on this economic benefit of circularity? Like, that's the one that I just beat my head against the wall going, the answer is right in front of us, folks. Like, it's staring us in the face, yet we're all chasing around. Like Lisa said, we got the irrational exuberance. We heard supply chain's cool, so we're jumping into the deep end without our ducky waders. We're sinking to the bottom, right? Like, what the hell is going on, right? Because we're grasping at these weights, like, decarbonization, which that's awesome. But hey, it's much easier if I focus just on circularity. Decarbonization will come. And oh, by the way, why don't I focus on profit first? I mean, companies, this is an easy win. I mean, let's look at the car industry. Let's look at, Mercedes, when they did the recertified, Mercedes. That broke the model on selling cars, showed all the automobile manufacturers that they could get in and double dip on selling their car a couple times. It was a profit first decision, right? So again, I come back to you, Kyle. What just in your own observations, why is the economic part of circularity kind of like missing from a lot of people?
I can speak, specifically to the architecture industry. The infrastructure is not even close to where it needs to be. Not even close. It's so easy to prove that by reselling an existing material that still has a lot of life, both the original owner and the new buyer, they're both going to benefit. Like, it's stupid simple. But the opportunity to facilitate that exchange, the opportunity to create an asset document of every living building and think out ahead, okay, in 5 years, I can sell this. Like, there's all of this information that needs to be generated still. The infrastructure is just not there, There's no easy way for an existing building owner to post their building for sale other than, as a whole. You haven't seen that before. No one's going through and documenting what materials are in their building and have the ability to post everything for sale for new owners. And it's so much more expensive because we're not designing them right in the first place.
And I'm already going to, because I can see Lisa chomping at the bit here. I can already see the wheels grinding, right? It's like, this is why she's investing. You're describing the problem statement of a particular vertical that, hey, if someone's got some answers, Lisa's the one to talk to about getting some money and capital to start driving that. But Lisa, let me swing over to you on that one. I mean, this is where we're going to get into group discussion. Like, that's Kyle's bringing up a bunch of what you're seeing firsthand.
This is why we have a community, a fund, and our operating company. And when I first met Brian and I told him, we needed all three, he was a little like, whoa, slow your roll. let's just focus on one. And then I've gotten a lot of, people saying, well, little lady, you should just hunker down and focus on one. It's hard enough to build a fund. And I'm like, well, we're already doing all three. So if you're not supporting me, you're in my way. And the reason we're doing all three is what Kyle said. There's just no infrastructure. So it doesn't matter how much we're able to invest in the emerging early stage technologies that are going to accelerate this change if nobody has the infrastructure for them to scale within. And so a perfect example is, again, regenerative fibers. The waste management, processing, sorting, disassembly, being able to really even just assess what blend is this garment and then how to sort it and then comb and separate and sort the fibers. It's a huge infrastructure issue. And so it needs to be a coupling of dollars at the early stage to support these innovations, but we're also simultaneously helping to accelerate the deployment of the infrastructure, working with the most leaned in existing businesses. And they're not going to be your legacy, like your big incumbent brands. They're sitting back and saying, spoon feed it to me and show me once it's proven. And so you're sitting here in a perfect storm, as I saw with the fashion industry, the fashion supply chain. It's a $3 trillion global industry, touches 1 in 6 people on this planet, one of the biggest polluters, carbon, water, chemicals, slave labor, child labor, all the horrible things. And investors are sitting here going, I don't know it. I don't get it. It's not of interest to me. There's no innovation in fashion. And then I'm sitting here seeing there's tons of innovation, just nobody's funding it. And there's a preponderance of female founders who receive less than 2% of all venture capital. So we're in a shitstorm, pardon my French, of lack of movement. The inertia is so massive. And like most things in my career, I'm sitting here going, well, somebody's got to do it. So that somebody happened to be me. And we're making good progress working with existing companies here in the US that have been spinning yarns, regenerating, creating short staple fiber yarns that we can process to give more strength and then weave and knit and cut and sew. They've been in business for 40, 60, 80, 120 years, privately held, able to move fast and want to stay in business for another 100 years. And we're just throwing them a lifeline. It's been 7 years of my obsession trying to help pull together all the players that actually can move to make this a reality. It's not an easy thing. There's no big quick win to be had for venture. And so they're like, but there is such massive upside if you've put in the time and done the work, which me and my team at Refashioned OS have been doing. And we're hoping, we're pretty confident that by the end of this year, we'll have some big announcements to be able to prove what's possible and to get at according to BCG and Fashion for Good, they had a report in January of 2020, the amount of capital that's needed just in early stage fashion supply chain innovation for the industry to hit the sustainability goals they set for themselves is $20 to $30 billion every year between 2020 and 2030. And I was asked in an article shortly after that came out, well, how many billions are being deployed? I was like, oh, no. It's maybe hundreds of millions.
Too many zeros, right? Dollars are being deployed.
Maybe hundreds of millions. And I know personally all the people around the globe that are deploying in this space. So if you want to hear something really terrifying, speaking of shiny objects, the metaverse and digital fashion, just in 2021, I believe, had 30 billion in capital deployed into it. So it's just, we're obsessed with shiny objects and not really realizing that, systems are designed for the outcomes that they produce. It's not like the weather. It doesn't just happen to us. We have to actively design for the outcomes we're intending to create.
Right. And I think, so I'm going to swing over to Marc on this because you also, so from Kyle now to Lisa, we kind of, go back into the profitability, right? That this actually circularity can become more of a business decision. And we've kind of talked on two different, I'll call them verticals, which is constructions and building materials and also fashion, two massive, and apropos, as Kyle was talking about building New York every 5 to 6 weeks, there's a backdrop to Lisa that's being built every 5 to 6 weeks, right? But then Marc, that's when I look at the 105, 106 gigatons of stuff that's consumed, of which 8.6% is, circular. There's this accumulation of nearly 1,000 gigatons of unused, whatever we call them, building construction style. And I think fashion's in there. So my question to you, Marc, is I think we've hit two of the biggest opportunities for circularity. I mean, the whole supply chain is circular. So construction and fashion. What else are you seeing if you verticalize kind of the circularity opportunities as size of markets, in the Circularity Gap reports or even your own observations casually?
Right. Maybe I can start also with the point you made, Lisa, in terms of basically you single-handedly try to connect all of these dots. And what we have been doing a lot as well is work with the financial sector. So from VC, private equity, but also with banks. And I think obviously that whole system is, if any system, just designed to keep the linear economy in the saddle. So what we've tried to do is really to work with startup organizations, with banks, with kind of the risk departments, et cetera, and really give them a real sense of these are the organizations we're talking about that are really kind of the next level organization shaping this circular economy. But they're small. They need to be scaled up. And I think you're doing an amazing job, Lisa, in supporting those organizations. But unless we can mainstream that, and unless we can get kind of these huge volumes of investment vehicles and bigger banks just understand it, appreciate it, change their systems accordingly, we're nowhere, because then we basically need to replicate you, Lisa, a million times. But we need to mainstream that. And that has been a real big focus of ours to look at. The other one, which may be a little bit less sexy, is kind of tax system. There is a big change here in Europe in terms of we need to tax labor less and materials more, so that you can design into your fiscal system, just into your economy, that it is rewarded to repair instead of discard. So that's, I think, a big lever. Privately owned kind of financial industry needs to reward this. Fiscal regimes can change. In Europe, quite recently, there was a ban on landfill. And I think other parts in the globe, that's really a far way from that. But those are just kind of incentives that are really kind of driving this system. In terms of volumes, there's so much, as I said, in the urban mine rather than the virgin mine that we need to tap into. How much exactly? You indeed mentioned the accrued 1,000 billion tons of stuff that we just have lying around in our landfills. In an average landfill, there's more gold than in a gold mine. So there's just value to be had out of that. But we just need to be able to extract it, get it out, and really change some of these fundamental systems. And maybe the last thing to say was on your behavioral change and the sets of values. The hope I have is, and you mentioned, Lisa, with your teenage daughters, mine is 7 years old, but you see that their sets of values couldn't be more different than my parents. I feel that I'm stuck maybe a little bit in between, but definitely kind of the new generation that's coming, they will value such different things. So that's, I think, the hope you can have in terms of really driving that system and accelerating that.
So, Marc, and I'm going to connect also with Lisa a little bit. This is something, and I'm it's a bit anathema to my own soul to say regulation. So let me just start by saying that it's a little difficult for me. It's even difficult for me to enunciate those words. Government involvement.
I knew that, Richard.
Right. Okay. I'm just going to say that freely disclosed. I'm fully transparent. But that said, what you mentioned, Marc, is maybe, and not taxes, but maybe there's a credit to enterprises that they could receive if they can prove circularity principles. So again, just top of mind as you were talking through that, I'm a Fortune 2000 company. Now all of a sudden I get a tax relief to show progress in my circularity in my supply chain. I mean, you want to talk about instantaneous circularity? There you go, right? So that then leads to, well, then how do you measure and demonstrate that? Well, you need some sort of circularity ratio, right? Around what am I buying that's new stuff versus what am I buying that's truly circular, right? And that number today, let's just say it's 100%, I'm consuming stuff out of the ground, but eventually I'd like that to be 50-50 or even 90-10 circular versus new stuff, right? So I'm going to come back to you, Marc, on that one is, how are you guys seeing the use of any kind of metric that we can actually use, right? That like a miles per gallon, like some sort of circularity ratio that's easy and simple and people can rally around it. And then where do you guys come in? Because you are at the policy level, right? You guys are interacting with the UN, with the World Economic Forum. Your CEO, Martin, was just in Davos talking about circularity from the circular economy point of view. How do you guys influence maybe that type of thing? So it's a common sense. I mean, Jesus, I can't believe I'm saying this. Common sense regulation, even though that's hard for me to say, but it actually makes sense. Like, where are you guys on that, Mark?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I mentioned, so the global report is putting a metric on our global economy, but we have been translating that to a business, a value chain, a city, a country. And I think that's really where it becomes very interesting. And it's actually not just one metric, but a whole set of metrics that starts to calculate kind of what is your circularity of your inflow versus what is kind of the circularity of your outflow. How can you measure that? How can you also kind of set targets just on the business level in terms of keeping yourself accountable, but also seeing where to invest, how to prioritize? We were talking to a waste processing company today, and they have no clue. I mean, they basically go from one opportunity to the other, but they don't really have a sense because they can't measure and therefore they can't track. So we have been implementing that in the last 2 years. We're part, indeed, as you mentioned, of some of these international fora like the Circular Economy Indicator Coalition, where we try to shape these sets of indicators for specific industries with the idea to just kind of engage in target setting and measuring progress.
Mm-hmm. Got it. And that's a perfect kind of like, again, jumping point over to Kyle, which again, we've kind of, Mark brings up, again, measurements and things like that, but also references the technology world, right? That's sort of my former world as a big kind of user need for circularity. We're seeing all these data center designs, trying to get into circular hardware equipment. I mean, I can go off and off and off on that one. But Kyle, I want to come back to your roots though, which is construction and building materials, right? That's still, I think, Lisa referenced $3 trillion in fashion in that industry, which again, that's another thing to point out here. And Lisa can give a sermon on this, which is anytime you're looking at investment, people want to first say, well, how big is the market? If you're looking at anything supply chain, it's $1 trillion market. Like that's the other thing that blows my mind, right? Like it's not billions, it's like 20 billion, whatever. Right? I mean, we're dealing with trillions, right? This is the world economy we're talking about at a supply chain level. So let me come back to construction. I still think that's the largest market segment within the world economy today. And Kyle, you probably know this. And, again, if we're building New York every 5 to 6 weeks, how do you see circularity, right? First of all, how big is the market from your perspective? And then secondly, where is it today on that kind of timeline of moving into circular? Because you're trying to push that right now. You're trying to get this like cement has got great carbon scoring for whatever reason. I don't know why the cement industry, but they become the carbon scorers of the experts. But the building materials themselves, like you said, like reusing, for example, I've talked about carpet or just the steel or whatever. So first question, how big is the construction world from your perspective, right? Because I think it's huge. And then secondly, talk a little bit about the specifics that you're seeing today that are kind of catalyze that circularity.
Yeah, the specific dollar value tied to the industry, I have no idea, to be honest. I'll write that one down to go look up.
Well, the world economy, just to put it in perspective, if you measured it by GDP, is about $100 trillion, give or take, right? So that's your baseline, right? So anything off that 100 trillion is a segment of it. So if Lisa's talking about fashion at 3, roughly speaking, which still sounds huge, that's only 3% of the world economy. My suspicion is building materials and construction is closer to like 30 or 40% of that, 100 trillion. Right. I don't know that. That's just my, inference from looking at a lot of data for a lot of time, but I know it's huge.
Yeah, without a doubt, it's massive. And it's, like I mentioned earlier, it's growing steadily every single year. And to maybe no one's surprise, it'll actually be the Southern Hemisphere that has the most growth in terms of the built environment in the next 50 years, more so than the Northern Hemisphere.
And because of that, you're thinking South America, Africa, and then a lot of the sort of the Southeastern Asian, South China. Yep.
Right. And so that was kind of a surprise to me. And so I'm still figuring out all of these projections of the future. But when it comes to me doing the best I can to incorporate circular principles into our processes, the first, I always call it the phase out phase, because we need to begin addressing which materials are no longer allowed to play the game. Like we're still using concrete on every single building, but it's the worst as it relates to embodied carbon. There's no next use for concrete once it's been demolished. You can maybe break it down and use it into gravel or whatever, but it's nothing valuable. There's no upcycling concrete. So the phase out phase, when I'm talking with our internal design teams as well as the owners, is okay, what materials actually make sense? And there's the whole debate about embodied carbon. I always like to include the variable of time because when we look at embodied carbon and we do life cycle analyses and we're comparing building materials, we don't ever see over time. It's always in its innate place, this very minute, how much energy has gone in to create this. But we don't ever look at the potential offset by choosing a durable material, even if it has a higher embodied carbon content than something that like mass timber, which is a durable, relatively durable structural material. It has a lower embodied carbon, but it's never going to match up to steel. Steel can last for hundreds of years if you use it correctly. Mass timber can't do that. So it's these discussions then of doing the life cycle analyses of these different materials, comparing them over time. And then there's the whole supply chain issue that is tying in and making this so much more difficult. Things that we were able to get our hands on in a couple of weeks are now taking 6 months. And so again, this is just driving the need to keep materials that we actually have already in use rather than pat ourselves on the back for recycling it and just going out and buying something new, the same thing we just had. So there's no marketplace for that, which is what I'm really trying to drive forward at this point. I think that's the gap currently between where we are and where we should be. So it's just amazing to see that we're still doing this, that we every single large architecture firm, the large firm roundtable, all 50 of them, they claim that they know what sustainable design is, but they're at best recycling 3/4 of the materials and letting the rest go to the landfill. Nothing sustainable about that because they're not looking at the whole life cycle. What good is a solar panel? How is a solar panel or mass timber recycle sustainable material if it ends up in the landfill? Like it just doesn't make any sense. We think we're doing so much better than we are, and we couldn't be further from the truth. So it's a lot of growth to take place still.
Oh, 100%. And again, one thing I don't want to fly over without kind of circling back to how we started, and even though we've kind of been talking about it, but system level thinking. You referenced a view of the Southern Hemisphere. And everyone on this call, we're talking at a global level when we talk about the supply chain. And as Lisa, and I'm going to come back to Lisa in a second here, this is another thing where it's just like, if you're not thinking globally about the supply chain, and the supply chain is one massive thing that is a true system. And this is the whole reason that I've been a huge fan of Marc's work at Circle Economy with that infographic. It's the first and only infographic I've seen that depicts human beings' supply chain in aggregate. That's what we're tuning. And if you're, as a supply chain investor, practitioner, participant, which we all are, by the way, if you're not thinking about that system, then you're not thinking in the context of the right way to solve things, right? And so I kind of want to swing all the way back into Lisa, because building off of talking about building, talking about circularity, talking about the economic, and again, I want to also be conscious of time here. We're going to kind of wind down, but some thoughts here, Lisa, as you look forward a little bit. We all want to drive to circularity, but and we've talked about some of these missing pieces, but what are you seeing coming up maybe this year or the next 12 months, that you're focused on to help, like, what's that next step, right? Because it's now, I feel like we're at a transition period right now. It feels to me as if all this work we've been doing, all of us collectively for the last 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years is starting to come to a head, right? Yeah. People are starting to come to you. I know, Lisa, you're booked out like months in advance just because you're doing this for so long. And finally, people are picking up the phone saying, Lisa, how do I do this? Right. So what are you seeing over the next 12 months in our march towards 50% circularity?
I think people are starting to understand that you cannot continue to try to make this billion-headed beast sustainable and circular. Like node by node, vendor by vendor, partner by, it's just insanity. So the approach that I think, and I'm focused on, is starting with constraints and really being able to define the circular inputs and the systems that will support, like start with your MVP, folks. What is the one fiber that we have in massive abundance here in the US that can be circularly regenerated? Let's focus on the infrastructure needed to support that scaling. And we don't even need to build entirely new infrastructure from the ground up. We can partner with, if we have the audacity to truly be collaborative and humble and say, we need to do this together. I don't have all the answers. No one's going to build a walled garden that is the holy grail solution. It has to be a collaboration. So the constraints of your localized region is where everyone should start, because the only certainty is that we're going to have increasing risk, requiring increasing agility, resiliency, redundancy, because the pandemic, these wildfires, forced mass migrations, it's all symptoms of the root cause of the climate crisis. And so the only certainty is that we need to focus on what we can produce locally, what are the most needed, most ubiquitous materials that can be circularly regenerated and turned into viable products that every consumer needs. Start there and then layer on your infinite optionality that, you know, primarily first world country consumers desire.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, and I'm going to, again, conscious time here, so I'm going to kind of sort of wind things down a bit, but like swinging over to you, Marc, I mean, Lisa brings up a ton of points here around what you guys are kind of tracking. I mean, I feel like the circle economy, your group in particular, really is starting to kind of come to the forefront as far as tracking data. That Circularity Gap Report is going to help illustrate this. How does the Circularity Gap Report evolve, kind of to Lisa's point, to help frame up the macro, which is here we are in the 8.6 and we want to get to 50%. But then on the micro, which is to Lisa's point, is, you know, where a lot of the solutions are going to actually come from. Because if you try to tune the whole system at once, that's probably too big of a pill to swallow. So we're going to have to take bite-sized pieces, which is kind of the microeconomies or localities, if you will, to Lisa's point.
Right. I mean, we have two tracks. The one is I just mentioned, so translating these metrics really to all different scales of the economy. So from a small and medium-sized business to a value chain to the globe. And the other one is also to leverage digital technology in terms of sourcing more of these data points that we require to get better quality data, which will provide kind of better insights on where to steer and where to correct for. So those would be kind of the two leverage points I would mention. Translate it to every different level and leverage digital technology to get better at it and more kind of agile to see where to respond and where to fix.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And there's also another point, sorry, but Lisa, you just pumped in my head here, but something else that Lisa also talks about that I think is fundamental to all of us achieving this goal, which is collaboration, openness, transparency, right? We're in a different world, and businesses need to understand that the world of the scarcity model is dead, right? We are in a world of abundance. We are in a universe of abundance. Right. And circularity actually allows us to go in that direction. Right. And in fact, the industries and businesses that are succeeding, and I can't prove this anecdotally over the last 10 to 20 years, are the ones who've embraced collaboration. Right. You know, versus the kill or be killed. I'm going to keep everything private. I'm never going to talk to anybody. And everything I speak about in my company is a top secret and, you know, blah, 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 blah. We can't do that. We can't do that collectively. Right. And so there's a business shift philosophically in the conversations around collaboration that I think is so important. And we don't talk enough about that, right? This is not going to be one by one company, right? This is a collaboration. It's all of us. It's all of our supply chain, right? So I'm going to kind of, again, I want to wind down here, but Marc, I mean, is that, as you think about that, maybe there's a third leg to the stool, right? Which is not just circularity as far as the macro and the micro, but then what are the kind of philosophical shifts emotionally? You know, circularity's got to be cool, right? Businesses need to collaborate. How do you lay out the tapestry of what the environment needs to be, you know, almost in a collaboration kind of manifesto, right? Because we won't get to the ones you're talking about unless there's collaboration.
Right. No, I mean, absolutely essential that point of collaboration. And I fully agree with you that anecdotally, you see that the ones that are really successful are the ones that are best able to do that. Maybe pointing out one thing, and that's, and I think I mentioned this 2 weeks ago with you, Richard, that some companies may be quite circular and are not aware that they are. I mentioned Spotify often in that example, that have really dematerialized kind of listening to music, not having kind of racks full of CDs, et cetera, that you need to lug around, produce, et cetera. So you provide a better product that's less material intensive. And I think we really should embrace also marketeers. Actually, I just came from an event with how can designers be part of this change? And they're crucial, whether they're fashion designers, product designers, all of those. So really the power of marketing, but also good product and service design is absolutely essential to make this transition as well. And I think that also touches on that point of collaboration.
Absolutely. And that's going to lead me right to Kyle. And I'm going to allow you to kind of wind things up here a little bit. A lot of fodder here for the updates to the book, right? Circular Economy for Dummies. You got some experts in here that are going to be relied upon. These are all the players, amongst others, that are out there kind of doing this stuff. But even for you looking forward, right? How do you, or take what you've kind of experienced with the current book and then look forward? What are you thinking about in the context of circular economy for dummies, right? Like, how is that conversation going to evolve over the next 12 to 24 months, right? Because I think you're also at you're at the foundational level, priming the pump, so to speak, for some other advanced conversations. But the whole point is everyone should read this book and just go, yeah, I get it at a basic level. But then eventually people are going to come back to you like, okay, Kyle, what's next? Right? What's next on what's the next chapter? How do I achieve this? How do I get profitability? How do I work with, Lisa in Refashion and get funded so that I can get my technology into this thing to make those changes? Like, what are you envisioning in the next 12 months as far as the economy?
You've touched on the key point that I think would really be at the heart of any update that I made to the book. Our goal when writing it was really to give examples, as many examples as possible. We spoke with hundreds of companies, anywhere from Intel to the first circular retailer, fashion retailer, Borrow Baby, in the US. So a whole range of companies. And we did our best to just provide as many as examples as humanly possible, low-hanging fruit of here's a way you can simply adjust the way you function as a company and begin harnessing the power of what is the circular economy. So I think the next level is really evolving beyond that simple format of making it digestible and easy and not overwhelming to switch business structure altogether, into how do you make it happen? I think tying in with the financing options, the government incentives, or the fines that come with you not being circular, like the state of New York and the state of Massachusetts often offer carbon penalties now for buildings and their emissions. And I very much see something similar happen as it relates to the embodied carbon of your building. So I think it gets down to rather up to a bigger scale, I think would be the next evolution of the book. Instead of individual examples, sort of that bird's eye view of the larger network at play and sort of what levers need to be pulled and when.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm gonna great ending point. We're a little bit bleeding over. I knew with each of you individually, and Lisa, you've been meeting for the first time, but an hour with each one of us is not enough, right? I think we could go for a long, long time. I first just want to thank all of you for taking some time to participate. Again, every year checking in on International Supply Chain Day. And again, to reiterate, the day itself is it's just a day, but the day we wanted to meet to it, we wanted to track how are we doing in the march towards 50% circular. And I think that creates a very easy soundbite for people to rally around. Marc and organization has got the data with which that is going to be tracked. I think Lisa, represents not only in investing, but also a thought leader that's kind of the new generation of, not even new generation, but really, thinking long about supply chain, which again, as a Silicon Valley X, I can, agree with you 100%. Like the investment world and the private equity world don't really understand supply chain because it kind of is, it's a little bit more private equity in the way it feels and looks, but it requires a venture capital mindset to actually invest in early stage, pre-seed stage kind of stuff. And then Kyle, of course, coming along and putting a book together that really says this is an economic force, right? Circularity is an economic force. I think that's a key point to transition the conversation from a feel good, environmentalist kind of thing, which is, there's nothing wrong with that. But really, this is economics first, folks, right? Like if we were to impress your board with one thing, circularity is not a frilly, fun feeling. It's actually a strategic initiative that drives profitability and de-risks your company, right? And if you're not speaking that at the board level, you're missing out on that one. So, and again, kind of coming around, making sure that we check in with everybody. This has obviously been live. We're going to post this podcast up in a few days. Of course, everyone can have access to it and do all that. But again, it's been awesome, a pleasure, an honor to have all of you here. It's really great that we all stay in touch. So we'll just keep staying in touch. We'll keep collaborating, keep the conversation going. And hopefully this also stimulates, even amongst all of us here, some individual things that might happen, right? I already see Mark and Lisa. I can see some data exchanges, some investment things going on there. I can see some data from, and a chapter about investing in supply chain technologies in an updated book with Kyle and Lisa participating. So really awesome. Thanks everyone so much.
Amazing. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Yeah. Awesome.
Thanks for listening. If you have any comments about this episode or topics on supply chain you'd like us to cover, you can reach us at supplychainnext@requis.com. And while you're at it, check out the Requis platform at supplychain.requis.com. Requis allows you to manage the full asset lifecycle in the cloud while collaborating with your entire value network to buy, manage, and sell your assets. Find out more at requis.com.